Hi, this is Lili Sanderson, and you're listening to Choosing Glory. Thanks for joining me this week. We are talking about the book of Joshua, and again, it's selected chapters. So they're treating some of these things lightly because they are stories that we're familiar with. And of course, there are some great principles and lessons to be gained from these stories, but not deep doctrine. So we can still learn a lot of good things, of course, from these amazing characters. And it can help us understand sort of the arc of God's workings with his children in mortality. And I love that. And I hope that that is working for you this year as well, that all of us are strengthening our view of God's plan for us, his children, to allow us the opportunity to receive whichever level of glory we desire and diligently pursue. There was a nice piece in the curriculum called The Historical Books in the Old Testament. And it was specifically mentioning Joshua through Esther as being stories of characters, which still talked about, kind of what was happening in the history of the children of Israel, the covenant people. I'm not going to go through all the information. I hope you got a chance to read it or that you'll take the opportunity to read it because I thought they did a nice job. Of course, they make some apology in a way, gentle apologies for, a culture that we understand very little of and how some people are kind of offended or bothered by things that we encounter in the Old Testament that had to do with the culture of the day and the law of Moses that we understand very little of. And of course, again, it's a condensed record. So it's covering so many years in a relatively brief or number of pages that it'll be interesting when we have the opportunity in the next life to review some of these events and characters and happenings with the complete story shared. So anyway, I look forward to that because these people are, the heroes of this time are remarkable. They are remarkable. I've never really been too bothered by the maybe odd happenings in the Old Testament occasionally, or what some people have seen as very harsh or whatever. I don't know why. It's just never really bothered me. I've always thought, we'll understand more when we have the rest of the story. And also, I could still see, and when I was really studying the scriptures on my own, I could see that arc. I could see God's goodness and mercy. And it really expanded my confidence in all that he has prepared for us, his children, to the extent that we are willing to partake of these incredible invitations. Anyway, it did make an interesting point, and I should have written this down, but the part that I thought was most interesting was then it said that before we've read half the pages of the Old Testament, we have covered the entire history, meaning that in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, it goes through the rest of the history of Israel all the way to the fall of the northern kingdom to Assyria and the fall of the southern kingdom to Babylon. And that is all contained in those books that are finished before half of the Old Testament pages are complete. And then we go through a little bit more of the history, and we go through many of the prophets that had administrations during the time of the Northern Kingdom or the Southern Kingdom. And those are great books that the curriculum will allow us to spend more weeks on. I think there are 5 weeks that are devoted to Isaiah, which is exciting because that's a book for our times, right? And also, of course, they have things like Psalms and Lamentations that are some of the praises or mournful prayers that are given by this people. So anyway, it was a nice summary. I'm taking too long talking about it. I didn't want to mention too much in the way of current event stuff this week. Just a little. There are these teen takeovers happening in cities in the United States. You may have heard of them occasionally in the news. They haven't been talked about too much, but occasionally they're just reported because they continue to happen. There have been many in big cities like Chicago and New York, more Chicago than New York, but also they've happened in Texas and in parts of Florida. And of course, these young people use social media. It's like they're born knowing how to use all this digital stuff, and they connect quickly on TikTok. In fact, they organize these gatherings that end up being violent. They organize them so quickly that the police don't get word about them happening beforehand because it's sort of a spur of the moment. It sounds like gathering that somebody gets the idea of, and they send out the word, and all these teens gather from all over the cities or areas. DC is another place that has had quite a few of them, and they usually do include some sort of violence or vandalism. They're jumping on cars and, doing some damage. Sometimes they loot something or attack somebody. Occasionally shots have been fired. I don't remember if anyone has been killed, but there's been violence. And these are young people. And the only response that has been shown is because it's kind of hard to put your finger on where to stop it when it's this sort of viral, this quick viral communication that happens. And then here come a group of teens without any real goal or organization, and then difficulty emerges, right? And the answer has been putting in curfews for adolescents. It doesn't seem to be extinguishing the problem. The most recent to speak about that was DC Mayor Muriel Bowser, who I guess they had placed a curfew for some other reason and has decided to extend it because of these teen gatherings that are problematic. So, what occurs to me when I look at this is fatherlessness. Fathers have such a powerful impact on the behavior of adolescents, particularly. I mean, it's not limited to that, believe you me, but there is a huge, huge influence that fathers have on restraining violent behavior in their kids if the father is a good man. And thanks to all of you good men who have set examples for your children. Again, children will, as they grow up, make choices for themselves. So they could have even wonderful teaching and still go into areas that we wish they would not. But the likelihood is reduced when they have the example of a good man. And not just the example, but the limiting factors of having a strong masculine parent who could be violent and is not violent. So let me kind of explain this a little bit. I did make just a couple of notes on this one, and I didn't end up quoting anything from it directly, but I did read the speech again because it popped into my head at one point. It was a speech that President James Faust made in conference at an Easter time conference. So it would have been an April conference. I'm sorry, I didn't check the year. I think it was in the early 80s. And the speech was called Father Come Home. And he did talk about how much importance there is in a mother as well, of course. But he was alluding to the fact that we are different. Shocker, I know. That women make for a different parental impact than men do because we are women and they are men. And that there is so much value and synergy available in that difference. So speaking about fatherhood, I have probably mentioned this before. I used to do some firesides occasionally years ago where I would talk about those differing impacts, and I would talk about some of the things that women are known to transmit in positive ways to their children because of their femininity. And I'm not talking about girliness, I'm talking about femaleness. And also the things that males, fathers, can transmit to their children that are positive because they are male and masculine. So one of the things that I had read, it's a long time ago now, but I really believe that this is a standard and continuing principle or effect. And that is that decades ago, they wanted to try to discover, as violence was increasing in our society, particularly amongst our youth, some sociologists were doing studies on what helped to generate empathy in children as they became adults. So how do you create an empathetic adult? Through their childhood experience. And I don't know if they were all sociologists, they were also some human behavioral scientists, but they did various studies trying to make links. And they actually were focusing a lot of attention on how women interact with their children because women are the nurturing parent typically, and they thought that would be a likely connection to be drawn. And what they found surprised them because the actual development of empathy turned out to be connected very strongly to the relationship with the father. And in fact, that particular variable that they identified, that I'll describe in a minute, outweighed the top 4 variables that combined that they had identified between mothers and empathetic children who grow into empathetic adults. Okay, so what was the variable? The variable was a father having positive interaction with his children 2 to 3 times per week. The father not ameliorated by the mother, so to speak. In other words, mom isn't guiding it and she's not instigating it or, bringing it into being. Dad was having positive interactions that he initiated himself with the children at least 2 to 3 times per week. And that single variable was by far the most impacting variable identified in terms of the outcome they were hoping for, which was children turning into empathetic adults. Now, that's what the study showed. And I remember seeing some of the associated studies. This was way back when I was doing my doctoral program, so it's a long time ago now. But I remember just thinking about it because I thought, okay, that's interesting. Why would that be? And I'm putting together a lot of other research and observations that have been made about, the way parents parent differently because of gender. And it occurred to me that kids, of course, benefit from what we call rough and tumble play. And most of that is with the dad. I mean, I'm not saying mom can't get a little involved, but honestly, it's kind of a dad thing, a guy thing to get down on the floor and wrestle with the kids, to just be more physical. And, dads are much more likely to toss little children up in the air than mothers are. Dads usually hold babies facing the world or in a football hold, and moms typically hold the baby front to front, kind of around the curve, and they're sort of holding that more protective position with the children. Observing them on the playground, we see that, like if a kid is doing something a little bit slightly risky, it's a playground. So maybe they're starting to swing really high and they're still very small, or doing something funny on the jungle gym or something. Anyway, mothers are likely to be saying things like, oh, be careful, don't swing too high. And fathers are observed to say things like, can you get higher than that kid next to you? Like, can you do this? Higher, better, strong. Anyway, so again, there's just this natural difference between the sexes in terms of how we parent. Now, one author that wrote a book called Life Without Father, I believe, David Popenoe, had a little couplet at the beginning of his book saying, mothers give their children roots and fathers give them wings. And that is kind of poetic, but it's actually very statistically accurate when you look at numbers and studies that have been done, because mothers do tend to give a foundation of security and do a lot of value transmission and so on. And of course, these are overlapping. Dads do that as well, but moms are very highly involved with those outcomes. Dads are very, very impacting when it comes to how children engage with the outer world as they grow up. So dad's interest is more likely to be associated with children's doing well in school, or performing well at jobs, or being comfortable taking jobs. Also, eventually having relationships that are successful. Less likelihood of divorce if dad has a very positive relationship with the kids. I mean, it's really interesting. And of course, none of these are absolute correlations, meaning that, if dad's involved, the kid will be successful at all these things every time. But there's a strong correlation that is found again and again. I've mentioned before that children's likelihood of attending church as adults is more highly correlated with whether or not their dad attended church with them when they were young and with the family. So it is interesting. Moms do tend to give children roots. Think about the Sons of Helaman, who said that they had faith. Why? We knew, our mothers taught us, and we knew that they knew that, and they believed it, and we believed our mothers. So we have a lot of examples of that scripturally, as well as a lot of interesting research about these various impacts. Of course, this stuff is politically incorrect these days, so people trying to erase the differences between the sexes are going to diminish that and say that it doesn't matter if kids have dads in the home or moms in the home, whatever. Of course, we recognize that most single-parent households are led by women, and there are necessary times for that to be the case. It's valiant what single mothers attempt to do when they are trying to follow in the path of their covenants and teach their children. And I truly believe God magnifies all diligent efforts in that regard. We know that our prophet, President Dallin Oaks, was raised by a single mom with his 2 siblings after his dad died when he was, I think, 7. So wonderful single moms out there. But of course, the ideal is not to be ignored, or hopefully we don't fail to talk about it with our children and encourage them to reach for that or get closer to it when they are able to. And there are really wonderful blessings that come with a very engaged father, which does seem to be much less likely in our world than it once was. I've talked about this before too. I'm going to mention it, though, again. I wanted to say something else about the empathy, and that is that, again, I was kind of putting together things that I had seen in different places and trying to understand. So it occurred to me that because, like we said, dad is obviously different from mom in the way they sort of supervise children or encourage them in different ways. Mom, at least at young age, is certainly more concerned about safety, and dad kind of encouraging experience and maybe taking appropriate risks and so on. And the combination can be great. But anyway, studies have shown that even babies know if they're being held by a man or a woman because, of course, our bodies are different and the way we hold the babies is different as well. And then the rough and tumble play and all that kind of stuff. So it occurred to me that children must know before they could ever articulate it that dad is stronger, his body is harder, more muscular, and he could be dangerous. He could be more dangerous in a physical sense, at least, than mom can be. But if he's a good man, he's not dangerous. He could hurt mom, but he doesn't. He treats her with tenderness and protection and kindness and care and love. He could hurt the children, but he doesn't. He treats them with kindness and protection and love. And I think that all came together in my mind as why dads are more likely to be associated with a child becoming an empathetic adult. Because they see that even when you have the power to hurt somebody, a good person doesn't do that. A loving person, a person who loves you and protects you and loves your siblings, loves your mom and protects all of them, that is the right way to be. To harness the natural man, to harness the power. We talked about that a lot recently, right? Power constrained appropriately is meekness. So here are these good fathers who could be dangerous, but they're not. They are protective in amazing ways of their loved ones, their families. So I think that when that is missing, we have these kids that are from communities often where fatherlessness has reached rates of over 90%. In fact, I read another book by David Blankenhorn around the same time as the Popenoe book called Fatherless America. Forgive me, I should have looked up the dates, but I think, they were probably 20 years ago that I read those books-ish. And the stats were horrifying. And even back then, the conclusion was that there are tons of inner cities and tons of our big cities in the nation of the United States where there are over 90% of the families without a father. One of the other things that I have mentioned is protest masculinity, which again shows that like a baby, of course, bonds with its mother even before birth and certainly after birth. But as little girls grow up, they start to separate a little bit and recognize that they are a separate being. But they're also girls, like mom is a girl. And so they're going to be kind of like mom when they grow up. But little boys, when they start that separation, realize that, okay, I'm not the same as mom. I'm a separate being, but I'm not a girl. So who am I? And if there is a man in the family, a good father, then they land on the father to help them become identifying of themselves as, okay, I am mom's child, and yes, we were bonded, but as I grow up, I'm going to be different from her and different from my sisters, and I'll be more like the man in my life, my dad, hopefully. And when dad isn't there, that need to separate from femaleness can turn into what they call protest masculinity, meaning that they swing too wide. And in seeking not to be girls, they become anti-female. Thus, look at all these communities that have so much fatherlessness. What music do you get out of there? Rap music. Tons of violent lyrics against women. It's tragic, but you can see it. Protest masculinity and being kind of wild and out of control is part of that. I've talked about the elephants. I don't want to tell that story again because I told it not too long ago about how they needed bull elephants to, whip the adolescent elephants into line. But that these things happen. We're not seeing teenage boys in these circumstances of these large cities where there is so much fatherlessness. We don't see the restraint. We don't see masculine energy stepping up and saying, like, settle down, guys. Like, this is not a way to be a man. They don't have that. So it's such a tragedy of our time. It was a nice speech if you want to review that. I mean, there's so much said to fathers, probably not enough, just because we have so many things to talk about and so many issues to address, but we need good men. And again, not every family can have a father in it because of circumstances so often beyond our control or the need to be safer. Nevertheless, if you can, reach out to other young people, particularly the young men in your wards and neighborhoods. And I'm not asking you to neglect your own children, but where you can, take an interest in them, put an arm around them, talk to them, show them that there is a man who cares about how they're growing up and that can answer questions that a young man wants to ask a grown man, and give them the loving support that they all need. If you're an uncle or a grandfather, I hope that you'll reach out in this special way to your family members that don't have a father in the home. There's so much that we need good men to provide, and I know we're all stretched pretty thinly, but let's do what we can. You probably heard about the anti-Israel rioters that seized a New York synagogue. It's a pretty well-known synagogue in New York City called the Park Avenue Synagogue. Apparently there was a group, they were having some sort of event at the synagogue talking about purchasing land in Israel, I think. And they were waving Israeli and American flags, and here came these pro-Palestinian rioters. And interestingly, New York City, it must have been the city council, because the mayor would have had to sign it anyway. There was some kind of bill passed that was to create a buffer zone around houses of worship so that no demonstrations could happen within a certain radius of the church or synagogue to try to protect those spaces. And It passed by a large margin. It was 40-something to maybe single digits. So that was veto-proof. But interestingly, the Muslim mayor, Zoran Mamdani, did not sign it. He could have signed it to show his support for that bill, but no, he just let it sit on his desk. But it was a veto-proof majority, so he couldn't veto it either. But anyway, interesting things happening in our country. There's another socialist mayor now in Seattle, and it's just the things we're hearing. It's kind of amazing that we haven't learned these lessons, and our children haven't, because they're coming out of these universities believing socialism is great. Some of them don't even wait that long, and they feel that way in high school. Let's do a little more sharing where we can with those younger people. Now, to end on a nice note here, I guess this was a LinkedIn post that my daughter Eden sent me. So that was lovely, and I wanted to share. She looked out the person who wrote it because she didn't know the name, but it turns out he was a sophomore at BYU in 2021 and played on the football team as a defensive back. I didn't know the name. It's Jalen Vickers, but he did a really nice post, and it kind of ties in with our father theme here. He wrote this: "We just officially became a family of 5." So they've had their 3rd child. "The world says having kids young will slow you down, kill your business, cost you success. I'll stand on this forever. It's the opposite. If you want to win in any area of life, get married to someone you love, have kids, and raise them together. The man you have to become to be a good husband, a good father, a follower of Christ, and a provider for your family is hard, really hard. But a man who puts his family first and trusts God is dangerous." I love this. Has a way with words. Let me just read that again. "But a man who puts his family first and trusts God is dangerous. He's not chasing money, women, or fame. He's doing whatever it takes to take care of his family the right way. That's the man worth becoming." I thought that was beautiful. Shout out to Jalen Vickers. I don't know, but I loved that. And thanks to Eden for pointing that out to me. Okay, we're going to talk about Joshua for the rest of our time, and these are familiar stories, so I'm going to touch lightly on the scriptures here and then tie some things together. Of course, the name of the lesson this week is "Be strong and of good courage," and this is a phrase that we first encounter in Deuteronomy chapter 31, spoken by Moses. In verse 6, "Be strong and of good courage, fear not, nor be afraid of them, for the Lord thy God, he it is that doth go with thee. He will not fail thee, nor forsake thee." So that's a very powerful message. It's repeated again and again through the book of Joshua. And it's something that he obviously learned from his mentor, Moses. And he was a valiant supporter of Moses, obedient to his directions, faithful, courageous, consistent. And as he takes over as the leader of Israel, this is repeated in chapter 1 many times: "Be strong and of good courage." And God tells him right there in verse 5 of chapter 1, "There shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with thee." And that is repeated a few times as well, that phrase that "as I was with Moses, so I will be with thee." So God is reaffirming that. He also tells him that he's going to magnify him in the sight of all Israel, meaning that, Moses has had this 40-year tenure as the prophet of Israel, and all these mighty works, leaving Egypt with God's mighty hand, all the plagues, whatever, dividing the Red Sea, manna in the wilderness. I mean, again and again, there are so many amazing things that Moses did as the leader of Israel through the power of God, that he was this archetype of Christ. So it's not easy to be the one that follows a leader like that. But God says, "I'm going to be with you, and I'm going to magnify you in the sight of Israel." So this starts happening right away. I guess let's mention this. I mean, again, be strong and of good courage is mentioned at least 3 times in the first chapter of Joshua. And then chapter 2, Joshua sends spies to Jericho, and we hear this, and there's the story of Rahab, the prostitute, apparently the harlot in Jericho, who helps the spies escape and so on, and is protected with her whole family that gathers there when the city is taken. But she communicates this to the spies. This is chapter 2, 9 through 11. I think I'm going to look at those verses. I know that the Lord hath given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us, and that all the inhabitants of the land faint because of you. Now, that makes sense, right? Like, word travels, even back in this day. And they have heard about this group of 600,000 people plus. That's a nation, a big nation on the move back in these days, and how all these miracles have happened with them. And then, of course, the king wants to have Balaam curse them, and Balaam instead sends a blessing on them because the Lord takes over and speaks those words through him. And they've seen the battle already with some of the Canaanites on the east side of the Jordan and how Israel prevailed in miraculous ways. So, okay. Verse 10, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you. That was 40 years ago, but they have heard it. And when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites that were on the other side Jordan, whom ye utterly destroyed. And verse 11, as soon as we had heard these things, our hearts did melt. Neither did there remain any more courage in any man because of you, for the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and in earth beneath. So word has spread. And even though these people are worshiping idols, they're afraid. Doesn't cause them to repent. And again, we've mentioned this a few times, the iniquity of the Canaanites is now full. They are having all sorts of orgies as they worship certain idols, and they are sacrificing children in the fires of Moloch. I mean, they're a pretty corrupt society, and they are terrified of the Israelites. So Rahab is protected when they come, and of course there's that amazing story of how, I don't want to skip, and I am skipping here. Let me go back to do this in the right order. Chapter 3, Joshua starts to take them over Jordan into the land of Canaan. Now, remember, before Moses' administration has ended as the prophet, he gives land on the east side of Jordan to 2.5 tribes, to Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh, that have their inheritance on the east side of Jordan. And then Joshua tells these men whose families are going to settle on that land that you can leave your families here, but I need you to cross over Jordan and fight with your brethren of the other tribes so that we will be a cohesive army and everybody will do their part to cleanse the land of the Canaanites. And then when we're done, you can go back to your families on the east side of Jordan. Now, as a crossing over Jordan, of course, I mean, at this point, it's a big river. It goes over its banks and so on. Maybe it's the spring. I don't know. Anyway, whenever it is, the Jordan is high and the current is strong. So they couldn't easily cross over, but God is going to magnify Joshua. So it's not the Red Sea, but it's a pretty big river at this point, surging over the banks. And God says, tell them to carry the ark. And as soon as they're in the water, and what does it say here? Chapter 3, verse 13, it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests that bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of Jordan, the waters of Jordan shall be cut off from the waters that come down from above, and they shall stand upon a heap. So he says, I'm going to cut off the current, like it's going to stop the water, and it's all going to pile up, and there will be dry ground, enough for the rest of the camp of Israel to cross over into Canaan. And this is, of course, reminiscent of the parting of the Red Sea at the command of God through his prophet Moses and now through his prophet Joshua. And that's what they do. We're going to come back to this idea of having to get the soles of your feet wet before the miracle happens. But now, there's some details about how they commemorate this and all this. In chapter 4, verse 14, on that day the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all the days of his life. And notice that's a pretty good description, right? Because, I mean, there was a love for Moses in a way, but there was fear. And they protested all the time, but they kept getting told off and penalized for their greater rebellions against Moses. So it really is sort of a fear-based relationship that they had with Moses. These people are not still very compliant, and occasionally they will, but there's a lot of little rebellion amongst them, sort of chronically. I was talking to my dear friend Helen recently, and she had heard the episode where I talk about what do people do when things go wrong, like the children of Israel. Every time, they're thirsty or they're tired of manna or, whatever it is, they rebelled and turned against Moses and immediately forgot all the miracles that had been done and the goodness of God and all of that. And Helen is from the South of the United States, and she made such a good point. She said it made me think about the history of Negro slaves in the United States. This was a terrible situation, and they endured all kinds of evil treatment. And yet, did they become idol worshiping? Actually, they came from a continent that was not Christian, and they came to the United States as slaves in terrible conditions if they survived the barbaric slave ships, and came into bondage and became Christian and deeply believing Christians. And we have those beautiful Negro spirituals that remain a part of our history in the United States now. And they're stunning. We don't hear them often enough, probably, but I remember singing them in even school music classes when I was in Indiana growing up and loving them. Loving them. I still remember a lot of the words. And I've encountered new ones through the years. There are some beautiful Christmas songs that are sung at Christmas time, and they're so tender and touching. So anyway, I love the contrast that Helen brought because I hadn't thought of that talked about the children of Israel coming out of bondage and slavery and how that can impact a people, but it didn't impact Caleb or Joshua that way, and the majority of the Negro slaves were not impacted in that way either. They maybe were compelled to be humble, but they were humble and they were converted to Jesus Christ. And they expressed that conversion, that love and belief, even in the bitterness of slavery, by writing these beautiful hymns to a loving Savior. I thought that was a great reminder that we have choice. It's not a done deal to say, A leads to B leads to C every time. It doesn't necessarily happen that way. Again, the law of Moses that didn't seem to really bring these people as a majority to Christ brought the Nephites to Christ. They had the same law of Moses, but they found the end of the law. They followed the law to its end, which was a belief in Jesus Christ. And that could have happened to these people. They could have become a nation of priests and priestesses. They could have become, as we said last week, a regional superpower at least. Oh, well. So they do go through a golden age that's to come with Saul, David, and Solomon, but it's temporary and there are issues during those tenures as well. But Joshua is magnified and they do fear him. And I do think that that's true and sort of sad. Now, of course, fear can be respect. So I'm not saying that it didn't also have a measure of respect or even love in it sometimes, but they're not like fully converted. We see that again and again. So anyway, they take a day to circumcise all the males because they haven't been doing that in the 40 years that they were wandering in the wilderness. The day after they eat of the produce of the land of Canaan, the manna stops. So just enough and not anymore. Now they are in a place where they can eat of the fruit of the land and plant their own crops and reap. And they are still at the beginning, of course, reaping things that they have not sown because the vineyards were planted, the crops were planted, the orchards were planted. and they are able to take over and annihilate the people who have inhabited the land in idolatry. So, of course, Joshua is telling them constantly again about the covenant, like obey God, don't worship idols, cleanse the land, don't fail to fulfill that direction of the Lord, because if you fulfill it, he will magnify you and bless you, and otherwise you're going to be cursed by the idolatry of the land, and it will impact you and your children and end up being a huge problem for you, and it certainly proves to be. Jericho, of course, this amazing story about taking the ark around the city, every day for 6 days, and the seventh day they go 7 times around and then give the mighty shout, and the walls come tumbling down. We get a great song out of it. It's a great song. Used to sing that with my children too. And then we have Israel going up against the people of Ai, and they are defeated. And Joshua is kind of like, what am I supposed to say to these people? The promise was that they would be able to win. And of course, Jericho was a slam dunk. So, how am I supposed to explain this? And God says they've sinned. So he has to march the tribes in front of him and all that. And he picks the tribe of Judah and then the different households. And it turns out to be Achan. And Achan does admit finally that he sinned. And he's taken some of the spoils of the last conquest that were supposed to go into the treasury of the Lord, and he kept them. So he's stoned, and his family, and whatever. And these are tough lessons, I suppose, but I don't know, what else gets the attention of the children of Israel? We have a stiff-necked and stubborn people that are clearly resistant to humbling themselves before the Lord and being obedient. They have a very strong leader at the helm. They sort of behave better, but not uniformly. And we still get a lot of trouble. At the end here of Joshua, I want to say this right now before I forget, but I hope I would have remembered. We have the first 8 chapters of Joshua, and then we skipped the last 2 for this week's reading. And right at the end, when Joshua is finishing his ministry with the children of Israel at about age 110, he says, get rid of the images that you have among you, or something along those lines. He knows that they have idols, little figures that they keep and they worship. So he's very well aware that even after all the victories, and at the end of Joshua, they even recount how many kings have been killed and how many of their cities and kingdoms have been taken over by the Israelites. He says, we haven't finished the job. You should finish the job, but you're going to have to get rid of those images. So this is a tough people. And there's some pretty bright lights that come out of them, and some of the greatest prophets come out of this group in generations to come, but it's not an easy people. So where do we want to just touch on? I don't want to go through too much, although I always look at the chapters in between. There is, in chapter 10, in one of the battles, it talks about how Joshua speaks to the Lord, and they're fighting the Amorites, and says in the sight of Israel, sun, stand thou still upon Gibeon, and thou moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stayed. Now, obviously, we know the cosmos a little better now, and while this is the way it looked to the people, I love that in Helaman chapter 12, when that great prophet is talking about the power of God and the nothingness of man, he says, even the sun, he can command the sun to stand still. And then he says, but we know really that it's the earth that moves and not the sun. So the prophets know those things. And as we know, Abraham was taught a lot of astronomy and celestial knowledge, of the heavens and the stars. And yet, every once in a while, God can do this for a purpose of his people to do a sign. And we're going to see that a couple of other times in the Old Testament as well, where it looks like the sun stops or moves back a certain number of degrees as a sign. And then, of course, it does talk about how they're conquering so much of the land, and 2 kings on the east of Jordan, 31 on the west are conquered by Israel. That's in chapter 12, but we have the names of them. And they divide it now, the inheritance, amongst the 9.5 remaining tribes. Now, note that the Levites don't get a land inheritance because they have the office of handling sacrifices and the rituals of the law of Moses that are done by that lower Levitical priesthood, not the direct son of Aaron priesthood, which are the priests, and only the prophets have a Melchizedek priesthood. During this time, the Levites are spread amongst all the tribes so that they can perform those offices. So Levi does not have a land inheritance. If you look at the maps at the end of the Bible, or you can find them online, that show which part of Canaan was designated for each tribe, you're not going to see one for Levi. But they are there. They just have an inheritance and support from all the tribes as they are fulfilling those assignments for the law of Moses. You have the 2.5 tribes on the east side of Jordan. Half of Manasseh, part of Manasseh, is on the west. Now notice Manasseh and Ephraim are counted now as 2 of the 12, and Levi is separate. So you've got 9.5 on the west of Jordan, 2, am I counting right? Yes, 2.5 on the right. That's 12, and that includes Ephraim and Manasseh, and it doesn't include Levi. So really 13, but Ephraim and Manasseh become the ones that we list, right? So, and those tribes have tremendous last days responsibilities that have been in the process being fulfilled since the beginning of the restoration in these latter days. But that kind of explains the inheritance. Now, I just have to say as well, you've heard the chants on these pro-Palestinian marches that started right after October 7th. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. They're talking about the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. And what's between the river and the sea? That's Israel. And they're talking about eliminating the country of Israel, the people, the country of the Jews. So it's that river and it's that sea. And this is the inheritance that God promised Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob would go to their descendants. And this is the time when they are first receiving this inheritance. Again, let's just jump a little bit to Joshua's farewell. Chapter 23, he exhorts Israel to be courageous and keep the commandments, to love the Lord, and not to marry and intermarry with the Canaanites who are still there. Verse 3, you've seen all that the Lord your God hath done unto these nations because of you, because he has fought for you. And I have divided unto you by lot these nations that remain. So he took the remaining Canaanites and divided them up for the house of Israel and said, these lands are for you and your inheritance, but now you need to finish the job. Verse 5, the Lord your God, he shall expel them from before you and drive them from out of your sight, and ye shall possess the land as the Lord your God hath promised unto you. Be ye therefore, this is verse 6, very courageous to keep and do all that is written in the book of the law of Moses, etc. And then cleave unto the Lord in verse 8. Again, verse 9, the Lord hath driven out these nations from before you. Verse 10, 1 man of you shall chase 1,000, for the Lord your God, he it is that fighteth for you, as he has promised you. Verse 12, but if you go back and cleave unto the remnant of these nations, in other words, if you intermingle with the Canaanites, even these that remain among you, and shall make marriages with them, and go into them, and they to you. Verse 13, know for a certainty that the Lord your God will no more drive out any of these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps unto you. And this is what we're going to find for the rest of the history of Israel prior to the ministry of the Lord. Scourges, thorns will be in your eyes. I am going the way of all the earth in verse 14. And then he warns them again in the very last chapter, chapter 24. This is really, the beautiful verse that we're all familiar with from Joshua. But before we get to that, just mention the detail that the bones of Joseph that they carried out of Egypt Remember, Joseph had said this before he died. He said, "Don't bury me. Just keep my bones." And when this prophecy is fulfilled, and of course, Joseph saw all of these things revealed to him in vision and revelation and prophesied a great deal. We don't have all of that prophecy today. We have some of it in the Book of Mormon, that he told them, "Don't bury me. Keep my bones, because the Lord is going to take you back to the land." Now, Joseph had never lived in the land of Canaan. Now, they dwelt in, as nomads. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and all the 12 sons didn't have their own land. They were always sort of renting, from people in the desert. But they were a great nation and looked upon pretty favorably, and a lot of people didn't want to make enemies with them because they had become a fairly strong people, but they didn't have their own land of inheritance. So Joseph never lived in Canaan, but he knew that the Lord had reserved that land for the house of Israel. So he said, "Don't forget to take my bones with you when God takes you out of Egypt, 440 years past my lifetime. Take my bones, because I want to be buried in the land that our God has promised us." It's kind of beautiful. And here's where we see that they fulfilled that promise to Joseph. And it's interesting because Joshua had been their leader for many years, but they were cleansing the land of Canaan before they decided that they were settled enough to bury the bones of Joseph in Shechem. So also the warning in verse 23 of chapter 24, "Now therefore put away, said he, the strange gods which are among you." So this is the one I was referring to earlier, that he knew you have idols in your stuff. You've got little tokens and idols or whatever that you're keeping, and stop that. Incline your heart into the Lord God of Israel, that he knows their weaknesses and that this is going to be a snare. Now back to the most famous verse of Joshua, verse 15 of chapter 24. "If it seem evil unto you to serve the Lord, choose you this day whom you will serve." Now think of the context. You've got these idols among you. So choose whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the flood, where they were idol worshippers too and got wiped out. So you really want to worship the gods of those people who were destroyed? But that's what you're doing. You're choosing to serve those gods, or the gods of the Amorites in whose lands ye dwell, because those are Canaanites, and God has told us to eliminate them, and we've taken care of a whole bunch of them. "But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." We talked a few weeks ago about Moses' great kind of ultimatum a little bit. I mean, not quite ultimatums, but they have that feel, don't they, where when he came down from Sinai and saw them worshiping the gold calf, he said, "Who's on the Lord's side?" And the sons of Levi came to him. It was one of those make or break moments. This is kind of like that, although there's not an immediate consequence, but sort of the same feel to it, where Joshua is in his final message to them to say, make a decision. Make a decision. Now, they don't really make that decision, but he is giving them an opportunity right now to think about it. Do you really want to serve these gods that they served before the flood, and look where it got them? Or choose Jehovah. Look at all that he has done for you. Look at all that he will do for you. But you have to choose him. You have to worship him in his way. If you don't, they're going to be a snare to you. And we're going to see that happen. There are, again, some very bright lights that come out of Israel. Some prophecies, again, meant for our day. Harper was reminding me of this story the other day. I don't remember. We couldn't remember where we would have heard it. I mean, it's sort of anecdotal, obviously, but I wish you could find the source. I hadn't thought about it for a while, but Harper said, remember that story about how, you could pray for an angel, and an angel could even come, but he would just quote Isaiah to you. So I hadn't heard that for a long time, and I was glad to be reminded, because anyway, we do have prophecies and testimonies of Jesus Christ, messianic prophecies, and great teachings that are going to come through these people. And I hope we are grateful to them for keeping this record. And there are some incredible bright lights for whom we can be grateful, and we can also hopefully be humble enough to look at our own weaknesses that we can be reminded of, and hopefully turn away from in our own journeys. Wanted to go back to the bit of the soles of the feet having to get wet before the Jordan River was stopped in its tracks and created dry ground for them to cross over onto. As I was thinking about, how many times in our lives have we had to get the soles of our feet wet? And I hope you have thoughts that come to you or experiences that you remember of times where you have had to take that leap of faith, where you've had to exercise your faith, which is seeing or not seeing and yet believing what we cannot see. Certainly, that's what happened here. Those who are holding the Ark of the Covenant were told, it's going to be okay. Just go there and get your feet wet. Don't worry, you're not going to drown. You're not going to get swallowed up by the waters. We're going to have a path open up, but you're going to have to get your feet wet first. I think that happens in our lives maybe more often than we even recognize sometimes, and it's not bad to go back and think about it. Have I been willing to get my feet wet before the path is opened up before me? I remembered this story that Boyd K. Packer used to tell. In fact, he quoted Mary G. Romney often in this story. If I remember right, because I couldn't find it immediately, but I'm pretty sure this is the case, that when Boyd K. Packer was called to be an apostle, his family had to move to Salt Lake. And he and his wife had 10 children. So they needed a big home. But remember, Boyd K. Packer worked for the seminaries and institutes. So he was a church education employee. He wasn't rolling in money. And he had this big family, which stretches $1, even more so when you've got a bunch of kids to take care of. And he was consulting with Mary G. Romney, who was a senior apostle, or maybe he was even in the first presidency at that time. Mary G. Romney was one of the counselors for a very long time. Really a doctrinal genius. He had that kind of raspy voice, not President Kimball raspy, but as he got older, it was sort of this gruff voice. But oh my goodness, the doctrinal expounding that he did was magnificent. So many of these great men have taught us so much and still can teach us today. So anyway, Boyd K. Packer was consulting with him, President Romney, about what house to buy because he was concerned about being able to care for his family in a way that would be good for them as they grew up. And yet he wasn't sure about the finances. And apparently President Romney told him, and this punchline was quoted many times, not always the backstory, but the punchline was quoted by President Packer often, which was, sometimes you have to walk at the edge of the light and a few steps into the darkness. I think it was my mother who first shared that with me when I was still probably not in college yet, or maybe just. And I've never forgotten that. It really touched me. And I think it's so visually beautiful that there are times God does ask us, exercising our faith, to walk at the edge of the light and a few steps beyond that, where we can't see how things are possibly going to work out, but we know this is what the Lord wants from us. And so we basically are getting our feet wet before the path opens up. They bought a home in Sandy. They were actually in the same stake as my dear friend Grace. And occasionally he would be generous enough to do extra kind of speeches for his stake. So that was an area that worked for his family, but apparently it, was a stretch, and then it worked out. And they were grateful to be there. One of the times he quoted him was this way. He doesn't tell the backstory, but he says, somewhere in your quest for spiritual knowledge, there is that leap of faith, as the philosophers call it. It is the moment when you have gone to the edge of the light and stepped into the darkness to discover that the way is lighted ahead for just a footstep or two. The spirit of man, as the scripture says, indeed is the candle of the Lord. And that's from Proverbs 20. And the name of this speech, which he gave to the seminary and institute employees, was called The Candle of the Lord. But he is referring to that same counsel that he got from President Romney. And I like this part too, that the way is lighted ahead for just a footstep or two. So I wanted to share this, and I've shared other times where we had to walk in the dark for a while or at the edge of the light. And Chris showed great courage in some of those ways too to fulfill the needs of our family when there was no way that it worked out on paper. But this was a similar time, I guess, or a similar concern. So I had been praying about something entirely different when I got the message that I needed to go back and do a master's in social work. And it was a really sacred experience. I don't want to trivialize it and make it too common here, but it was a voice in my head, an astonishing experience where it was a whole sentence and I could repeat it to this day exactly what it said. Of course, I immediately, as soon as I got home, because it was just before we all had cell phones, I called Chris and told him what had happened. And he said that there was an MSW program that had started recently at UNLV. We were in Las Vegas, so it was not like I could ever leave my family and go somewhere else to school. And there hadn't been an MSW program in the Valley until just like the year or two before. And Chris was aware of it because of his profession. And I had had no thought about it, so I certainly hadn't looked into anything anyway. I didn't want to do it, but I knew that this was from the Lord, and Chris was immediately encouraging. So I had to, kind of put some things together. And okay, sort of unnecessary detail here, but I was in the honors program when I was an undergrad at BYU, and we didn't have regular general education requirements. We could put our own proposal forward about how we were going to have, sort of broad educational experience by taking different kinds of scholastic classes. And so I had done that, but I, didn't do a lot with science. I think I took an honors seminar in science, and we did like 2 weeks of geology and 2 weeks of astronomy and 2 weeks of chemistry and, whatever. And it was fun. It was a fun seminar, but that was good enough for science. And yet, because of the Council of Social Work Education, CSWE, that is a national council that licenses or accredits MSW programs across the nation, a requirement for entering an MSW program was a biology class, freshman biology. And I'd never taken that. So I was like, oh my goodness, this is going to stop me. I mean, my grades are good, whatever. I took all the tests, but it was like, I've got to go back and take a freshman biology class. And so the only game in town, UNLV, I signed up for a freshman biology class. And this was, had to be completed before I started the program the next fall, whatever. It worked out. I mean, honestly, I felt so weird sitting in that class with a bunch of freshmen. And I was like, I can't believe I'm here. Like, how am I going to get through freshman biology? And there was a young man a couple of seats away. We were in a theater kind of seating, and people were spread out a little bit, but there was a guy a couple of seats away, and he turned to the guy in front of him and he said, "Hey man, do you have a pen I can borrow?" And I thought, I guess I'll be okay. I brought a pen. So anyway, it was surreal. Too much information, but it's still vivid in my mind that I was kind of like, what am I doing here? But I got through that, and then I'd been accepted, whatever. But I was concerned. Chris was so faithful. He knew things would work out. But we didn't have it in the budget to pay for tuition for a master's program. And I didn't want to try to squeeze that out of the family budget and make everything harder for all of us and have my kids sacrifice too because of this money that needed to go to tuition. So here I am trying to figure out how it's going to work. And you can apply for graduate assistantships that will pay your tuition. And also back in the day, this is, I don't know, 35 years ago or something, but back in the day, they paid you $4,000 a semester on top of your free tuition if you were a graduate assistant. So I thought, well, that would be good because then I could have the tuition covered and even have a tiny bit of a bonus. I mean, tiny, 4,000 wasn't bad for us those days, but you had to give 20 hours a week to the professor. And I'm like, there is no way in the world that I can squeeze 20 hours a week out of my family time and school time to do research for a professor. Like, that's just impossible, but I don't know what else to do. So maybe I just won't sleep and I'll just have to make that happen. And the way they did it at UNLV was they had this sheet where you could put in all your scores and, transcript grades, whatever. And I think you wrote like an essay or whatever. And then you just checked everything that you might be eligible for. And one of those was graduate assistantships. And then there was this fellowship, and there were some other, anyway, whatever. There weren't too many things that were available for this master's program, but whatever. One of them was a fellowship, and they only gave one in the university every year to somebody in one of the graduate programs. And there were several on campus, of course. And I got that award. And it was a miracle. And it gave me exactly the same thing. It gave me free tuition and $4,000 a semester for the year of the fellowship. It was a Marjorie Barrick Fellowship. And I was so grateful. And I remember when I got the letter and I called Chris, and right after I said my hallelujah prayer. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is such a blessing because I won't have to do the 20 hours a week, which I really don't have. But then the problem was I get through that first year. And now all the kids who already had graduate assistantships with the professors were most likely going to retain those positions because they'd established a relationship with the professors, and, they were doing good enough work for them to be retained. So they weren't going to change that up unless somebody blew it royally, and nobody had really done that. It wasn't a very big program, so I knew those kids. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do now? Because now there's a second year, and this was just a one-year fellowship. So anyway, I went to the application office and whatever. And I said, look, I don't mean to sound ungrateful or greedy, but can I apply for that again, that fellowship? And the young person at the desk was like, it's a one-year award. And I said, I understand that. Is there something that prohibits my applying for it again? And he gave me kind of a funny look, and he said, well, I go check. And he went, found a supervisor or something. And the supervisor actually came to the counter there and said, this is a one-year award. I said, I am aware of that, and I am super grateful for it, and I don't mean to be greedy, but if there is no prohibition against applying a second year, can I do that? And the supervisor said, well, yeah, there's no rule against it, but it's never been given to anybody more than once. I said, well, thank you very much. And I went ahead and checked the box and put in my essay. And a few weeks later, I got something in the mail that told me that I had received it for the second year. And again, I went into my closet and said a hallelujah prayer. And really, there were tears of joy in my prayer of how, like the Red Sea had parted for us. Because I didn't have those 20 hours a week, but we really needed the support. And I didn't want to impose this on my family's budget, which was still pretty tight. And I called Chris right after my prayer, and his answer, this was so typical Chris. He said, I think I'm beginning to hear your voice. He had been supportive from moment one, but he too saw that in a way we had gotten our feet wet. We had moved forward believing that the Lord would help us find a way that was not visible or even likely in this case of getting the second year's award. You think back and think, like, what were we thinking? I mean, and I guess we weren't, we did our studying it out in the mind, but it just didn't work out on paper. But we had to believe that this is what the Lord wanted because the Lord had said it. And so we were willing to get our feet wet. I hope that you've had those experiences as well, and that we'll keep having those experiences. Believe you me, I have been making leaps of faith regularly since losing Chris. I'm a little more used to it at this stage of my life than when we were younger. So you do get used to not seeing how things are going to work out, and just knowing that somehow they will, not necessarily in comfortable ways, not without troubles, not without strain or stretching or hopefully refinement. And that's what I always hope, is let this painful situation show up in the refinement of my soul. Let it count for something, please. And I believe that the Lord will answer all of those things with a blessing in our lives and on our heads. Now, I'm just going to say a few things about courage, because this whole thing is about, all this repeated message to be strong and of good courage. So couldn't help myself. I looked up some things that were bouncing in my head. C.S. Lewis, I love this statement. Courage is not simply one of the virtues, but the form of every virtue at the testing point. Beautiful and absolutely true. Like, all of the virtues require courage when we have come to certain points, those testing points where it would be so much easier to give up on the value or the virtue or the principle of the gospel. But courage can carry us over the finish line or further onto the path. This is John Wayne. Many of you will have heard it. Courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway. So the Duke, wisdom by the Duke. Courage is being scared to death and saddling up anyway. Another statement by John Wayne, all battles are fought by scared men who'd rather be someplace else. That was touching to me too. God be praised for courageous men who have protected home, family, and country throughout the generations. Robert Louis Stevenson, everyday courage has few witnesses, but yours is no less noble because no drum beats for you and no crowds shout your name. That's tender. I'm going to read it again. Everyday courage has few witnesses, just the kind of courage we show day to day to try to live our faith and move forward when we can't see how things are going to work out. Everyday courage has few witnesses, but yours is no less noble because no drum beats for you and no crowds shout your name. And then this that I liked, Joseph Epstein, I don't know who that is, I didn't look it up, said that courage is 9/10 context. This is nicely said. What is courageous in one setting can be foolhardy in another, and even cowardly in a third. This is just to say that sometimes courage can show up differently in different situations. Courage can be saying, I'm sorry, and other times it's demanding an apology. Sometimes courage is saying yes, and other times it's saying no. Sometimes courage is trust and delegation, and other times courage is stepping up to take ownership. Sometimes courage means admitting we can't go it alone, where other times it's knowing you need to face things alone. Sometimes courage is facing the truth that you don't know, that you don't see, right? What he's saying here too is just recognizing that we don't know something, and it takes courage to accept that and to acknowledge it. Some of us need courage simply to get through the day. Someone reading this might be facing a mental illness or a personal crisis, and simply getting out of bed in the morning takes courage. Author Marianne Rademacher says, courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes courage is the silent voice at the end of the day that says, I will try again tomorrow. Sometimes courage is failure. Sometimes courage is doing something anyway when you know others might not see it as courageous. So how do you get it? How do you build courage? After all, we aren't born with courage. Courage is trained. Going back to the definitions of courage, it's not simply the absence of fear that builds courage. It's controlling your reaction to fear. It's also a quality of mind or spirit, having a clear sense of your values and mission, and tuning into the heart. Courage takes at the very least an acknowledgement of fear or that you're out of your comfort zone. Courage is an awareness of risk, that something can be lost, and settling up anyway. I really like that, brothers and sisters, because I do think that that's balance. It's wise. Courage is not always just charging in. Sometimes it's waiting. Sometimes it's meekness, acknowledging our fears, recognizing them, and turning them over to the Lord, putting them on the altar, and taking a measure of faith back with us, and increasing that faith again and again until it becomes easier to go forward at the edge of the light and a few steps into the darkness. Of course, these hymns come from various scriptures, but I just pulled this one verse from How Firm a Foundation to end with. Fear not, I am with thee. Oh, be not dismayed, for I am thy God and will still give thee aid. I'll strengthen thee, help thee, and cause thee to stand, upheld by my righteous, omnipotent hand. I love the goodness of God. I love his invitations to us to have all that we're willing to receive. And I do believe that what we are willing to endure in this life often is what will allow him to give us in the next. I look forward to that time. I know I am weak. I have frailties that have really reared their head in these last couple of years that I am starting to see subside a little bit as I maybe get my feet a little bit more under me, but it's not really my feet that are under me. It's really the Lord that is supporting me. And yes, the priesthood power of my husband and the mercy of the plan, the loving arms of my Savior. I testify of these things and invite all of us to choose glory, choose all the glory, choose celestial glory, and pursue sanctification, become a Zion-ready people. The Lord is coming. As ever, my loving thanks to my husband, Chris Anderson, and Doug Larson of Point Digital. Take care.